Today is Wednesday, July 28th. It's about 10 something in the morning, about 10:30ish. We are at the law offices of Robert Vason, and we're speaking to Robert Vason. My name's Ernie Mosteller, and I'm going to conduct this interview. So let's start out with you, Robert. How long have you been in Mount Dora? When were you born? Where were you born? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. My name is Robert F. Vason, Jr. My father obviously was Robert F. Vason. He came to Mount Dora in 1945 after World War II. I was born in 1947. The only reason that I was not born in Mount Dora, since my family, my mother and father had moved here in 1945, was because I believe that my father did not think much of the medical facilities that were in Mount Dora in the late 40s, and in mid-August of 1947, he put my mother on a Greyhound bus at Caudell's Texaco station at the corner of Donnelly and 4th Avenue. Let's see, that would be the southeast corner of Donnelly and 4th Avenue. Sent my mom to Tallahassee, where my father's parents lived on a little 10-acre farm, and as a result of that, I was born there in Tallahassee on August 30th of 1947. My father was a dentist, was either enlisted or drafted into the Army in 44, came out as a captain in 45. Here's an interesting little story with regard to how he came to Mount Dora in 1945. He purchased a dental practice that was owned by an older dentist by the name of R.G. Wells. Dr. Wells had been practicing as a dentist in Mount Dora and owned a dental practice and office building at the corner of Donnelly Street and 6th Avenue. That would have been on the southwest corner of Donnelly Street and 6th Avenue, across from Donnelly Park, where most people might recognize that Jim Flash practiced in that same office building from 1974 until last year, and now a Dr. Stillman is in that dental practice at that same corner. But anyway, in 1945, my dad purchased this practice from Dr. R.G. Wells, and I knew that Dr. R.G. Wells had a son by the name of R.G. Wells Jr., or Bobby Wells, who was also a dentist. But the son, Bobby Dentist, was about 6 months from graduating from dental school when the practice was sold to my father. And for years and years and years, I never could understand how Dr. Wells and his family had managed to sell the dental practice to my father when Dr. Wells' son was within 6 months of graduating from dental school. So that was always a mystery until, and Bobby Wells did in fact graduate from dental school, came to Mount Dora, built an office building and practiced dentistry here in Mount Dora for 40 or 50 years. In the office, I believe, where Bob Schweiger now has his appraisal business, which I think is maybe the corner of 11th and 11th Avenue and either Tremaine or Baker. Anyway, Dr. Wells, Bobby Wells, practiced here along with my dad, competitors, I guess you would say, for years and years and years. And then Bobby Wells finally died, and then about 10 years ago, his widow, Ethel Wells, passed away, and I was handling Ethel Wells' estate. And in the course of doing that, Ethel and Bobby Wells' daughter, Nancy, was my client and came to see me, and so I asked Nancy one time about this mystery. Why on God's earth would her grandfather have sold the grandfather's dental practice to my dad when Nancy's father was within 6 months of graduating from dental school? And Nancy solved the mystery for me. It turns out that my father did not purchase the dental practice from Dr. R.G. Wells, but purchased the dental practice from R.G. Wells's widow. Dr. Wells, R.G., had passed away about a year before my dad purchased the practice. And my dad actually purchased the dental practice from R.G. Wells's second wife, Bobby Wells's stepmother, not Bobby Wells's mother. I do not know what my father's practice was with regard to dentistry, but while we're on that particular subject matter, there are three things that I'm actually fairly proud about my father and his practice of dentistry. Perhaps the thing that I am the most proud about was in 1951 or 1952, he became acquainted with a young black woman. This was 2 or 3 years prior to Brown versus Board of Education. And this young black woman, who was 18 or 19 years old, I believe was a graduate of Eustis High School. He paid for and sent her to dental assisting school, from which she graduated and became very proficient as a dental assistant. He then hired her. Her name was Josephine Worthy. And Josephine, Josie as we called her, was my father's chairside assistant for a year up through the date and subsequent to the date in which my father was killed in an automobile accident in 1974. She continued there for 20 or almost 30 years, even after Dr. Flash purchased the practice. She stood right there beside my father, a young black woman, handing my father dental instruments while he worked on all of the citrus barons and prominent white people here in Mount Dora throughout the 1950s, 60s, and up until his death in the mid-70s. He was very progressive, I thought, in that regard. And I believe, I know for a fact that all of his patients just loved Josie to death. His dental practice there consisted of 3 operatories, and the front door was on Donnelly Street, and the first 2 operatories were on the right-hand side of that office building facing 6th Avenue. The third operatory was in the very back, and my father, I would like to believe, treated the black patients and the white patients equally, with this exception. The third operatory on the back side of the building had an entrance door, and it was through that door that for years and years and years all of the black patients entered, and it was in that operatory in the back of the building which my father did most of the dental work for whomever his black patients were. The entranceways there was no signage on the entranceways. I think that was just a given that the black clientele or patients entered through the back and the white clientele or the patients entered through the front. My father, just a couple other items about the practice of dentistry. My father was very, very active in dental politics and in fact became president of the Florida Dental Society, which was the forerunner to the Florida Dental Association, which was somewhat of a feather in his cap considering he was from the little Mount Dora 2,500, 3,000 population. And I remember he hosted a dental convention for the Florida Dental Association here in Mount Dora at the Lakeside Inn, and my brother and 2 sisters and I were assigned the task of fixing postage stamps to the invitations. And we put all the stamps on the invitations upside down. My father was just absolutely appalled that we had it's a very important invitation that we had put the postage stamps on upside down. one other little dental story, and then we'll get off of this topic. But because my father was very active in dental politics, he traveled all over the state of Florida, and would every time that he drank. He was a drinker. And every time he would go to a bar or a hotel in which they had, I don't even know if the young people today even know what a swizzle stick is, but there were plastic swizzle sticks that were served with drinks, and the clientele would use the swizzle stick to stir the drink. Well, almost in every bar or every hotel throughout the state of Florida, the United States for that matter, almost every swizzle stick had a little icon on at the very top of the swizzle stick that identified the location of the hotel or the bar. For example, if you went to the Playboy Club, the swizzle stick would have a little plastic bunny at the very end of the swizzle stick. Well, my father collected these swizzle sticks over the years, and whenever he had a piece of scrap gold that he would have acquired through the practice of dentistry, legally or illegally, he would save the little gold scraps. And eventually, my parents were divorced in the early 60s, and he remarried in 1972, 2 years before he was killed in this car wreck. And as a gift to his new bride, he took dental impressions of all of these various icons off of these swizzle sticks, melted down the gold scraps that he had accumulated over the years, and made for her a charm bracelet consisting of all of these various icons that he had accumulated from his travels all over the United States and the state of Florida. I do not know how much that charm bracelet weighed, but it was hefty, let me just say that. It had some weight to it. Well, and I don't mean to keep coming back to this automobile accident, but when my father was killed in an automobile accident down in Orlando in 1974, he and his wife Ellen were in the car together. Ellen survived, but she had that charm bracelet on her arm at the time of the accident. Well, that was the last time that charm bracelet was ever seen. It disappeared that night, either at the hospital or at the scene of the accident, but it was never seen by any of our family again.
What are some of your earliest memories that you have of life in Mount Dora? What part of town did you grow up in?
What part of town did I grow up in? When my father came here in 45, we rented a house. I was told, I was not here. We rented a house in Zellwood. The first home that I remember living in was in Sylvan Shores at the corner of Washington. It would have been the northeast corner of Washington and Lucerne. We sold that house, my family sold that house in 1952 or 1953 to people by the name of Tanner, T-A-N-N-E-R. The woman, Marion Tanner, lived in that house, I believe, for 50 years after that. And she was the nurse for Fred Andrews, Dr. Fred Andrews, and Bobby Crow, Robert Crow, I believe, for years and years and years. The second house that we lived in...
Did she have a son named Bill?
Beg your pardon?
Did she have a son named Bill?
Marion Tanner had a son by the name of Larry.
Okay.
And two daughters, Marianne, I do not remember the name of the other daughter.
Okay.
Second home we lived in was on Sheridan Road, in the middle of the first block there. It was in that home that that I remember getting our first television. So it would have been 1952, 1953. But basically grew up in Sylvan Shores. Third home that we lived in was on Morningside Drive on Lake Gertrude. So Mount Dora in the late 40s, early 50s through, actually really through the early 80s was primarily a retirement community. Had its share of snowbirds, people who would come here in the wintertime but who had homes up north. I do not remember any industry in the city of Mount Dora other than maybe the fertilizer plant out there off of Rossiter or Road Street. They say in Texas cattle is king. Well, in Lake County anyway, citrus was certainly king during all of that period of time. And this was before 441 was four-laned. So you have to imagine that what Mount Dora looked like in the late 40s and early 50s. 441 was a two-lane road that ran from south of, or actually I think down 441.
It goes all the way to Miami.
Yeah, it may go all the way to Miami. It came up through Orlando, came out of Orlando, named, very appropriately, the Orange Blossom Trail. Two-lane road, came through downtown Apopka, made its way to went through downtown Mount Dora, hit the one traffic light at the corner of Donley and Fifth Avenue, became Fifth Avenue, but 441 continued on as a two-lane road through downtown Tavares, on to Leesburg, Ocala, all the way to North Carolina or Tennessee, I believe. So you have to, and all of the surrounding areas then were citrus groves, all citrus groves. So citrus was by far and away the main industry at that time. It provided summer jobs to teenagers, including me. I remember working for Mount Dora growers in the very early 60s, 1960, 61, 62. I would have been 13, 14 years old. They paid 90 cents an hour the first summer. The second summer they paid 95 cents an hour. Our job during the summers were, we would be at the growers, Mount Dora growers there on Highland Street at 7 in the morning. We would all load up. We would load up with the black farm workers in a covered flatbed truck that had benches inside, along interior inside the cover. It had wooden boxes either underneath the benches or on the outside, in which our tools were transported. And our jobs were to hoe by hand and prune with looping shears citrus trees for 90 cents an hour from 7 o'clock in the morning until 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You would bring your little sandwich or two in your little paper bag, and it didn't take long to realize that you needed a big thermos, although there were water, there was water on the truck. But citrus was king, and that was a summer job in which we would start at one end of a row in the heat of summer with our shorts on, our boots on, and maybe a shirt on until 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the morning, but then that was that. And we would work down the entire row with our hoe and our looping shears, hoeing orange trees and looping, cutting the dead wood, trimming the dead wood out of the citrus. So citrus was by far and away the big money maker.
Did you work wintertime shifts? Did you work
Wintertime,
lighting heaters and smudge pots and stuff?
Did not. Yes, and I'm going to give. I'll get. Yes, there were several. The big citrus families were the Sadlers, the Simpsons, the Estes in Tangerine, the Heist in Tangerine, the Bakers. I'm sure that I have the Blands. There were 5 or 6 citrus people, big citrus people, and back then, if a person, I'm was going to say a man, but typically it was a man, but if a man owned a 10-acre grove, and that's all he owned and that's all he did, he could very easily support a family of 2 or 3 children. He could buy a new Cadillac every other year. He could live in a very nice 3-bedroom, 2-bath, ranch-style home. He could educate his children at with college educations, and could live a very, very comfortable life on the proceeds from a 10-acre citrus grove in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Other citrus-related jobs that we did in the wintertime, we would, quote, fire the grove. That was always a grand, we loved to do that because the freezes would very rarely happen on the weekend. They would almost always happen on a school night. Our job was to go through the groves and set out smudge pots, and I don't know if anybody today even knows what a smudge pot looks like, but they were...
Oh no, we have images of them, and I've still got 2 sitting on an old barn. So
they were round affairs that held kerosene or fuel oil, diesel fuel, with a little chimney-type smokestack, and we would set those off the trailer throughout the grove, and we would then fill them with fuel oil or diesel fuel or kerosene, and then we would watch the thermometer at night, and when the temperature dropped below 29, 30, 29, 28 degrees, probably about 4 or 5 in the morning, we would then walk through the grove with our torch, and we would light the various smudge pots. And the smudge pots, we would call that firing the grove, and we thought anyway, or the growers anyway, thought that that was an acceptable method for freeze protection, long before the irrigation systems came in, which are now used to irrigate or for freeze protection for whatever groves are left. The biggest draw of firing the groves was the ability to get out of the house at nighttime and drink beer, which we all did underage at 15, 16, or whatever, however old we were. But that was the big draw in firing the groves, and I don't remember if we were ever paid for doing that. I don't think pay was particularly important. Not nearly as important as drinking the beer. The other thing that we would do, citrus related, was to irrigate the groves, and back then there was no in-ground irrigation system at all. It was all done by, I believe they were 4-inch pipes, 4-inch diameter pipes, 20 feet long, that were joined together with a locking clasp, and we would lay the pipes out through the grove, connect them to a diesel pump, and most of the time there were no wells. Most of the time all that water that we used to irrigate the groves came out of the lakes, and we live in Lake County, and there were plenty of sources of water.
One of the benefits, obviously, of moving pipe and especially firing groves was you get out of school.
That is true, but how we got on this topic was really what did Mount Dora look like in the 1950s and early 60s, and I was trying to say that this was before 441, new 441 came in, and there was when I do remember when they built new 441, 4-laned the 441, there was a big controversy about where 441 should be located, and some of the towns, Apopka for example, they voted to keep the 2-lane 441 exactly in the same location where it was, and it went right through downtown Apopka, and that is why downtown Apopka looks today the way that it looks. When the proposal came to Mount Dora as to where 441 and Mount Dora should be located, the same issues, of course, arose. Should it be located exactly where the old 441 is located now and run right through the middle of downtown, or should they go around Mount Dora? And The controversy was fueled by the downtown merchants on one hand, who felt that if the highway 4-lane went through the middle of downtown, it would bring business to the downtown businesses and Mount Dora would flourish. There was another opposition to that did not want a 4-lane highway running through the middle of our historic downtown. This was in the late 1950s, 58, 59, could have been as late as 1960. So the alternative was to route new 441 around Mount Dora as opposed to having it run through the middle of downtown. There were the citrus growers, Dr. C.M. Tyre in particular in Eustis, was adamantly opposed to routing 441 around Mount Dora because he owned extensive citrus holdings at what is now the intersection of Eudora Road and 441, which his argument at the time was that he was going to lose thousands of dollars in citrus proceeds from if they put 4-lane 441 through his groves at the corner, which are now at the corner of Eudora Road and 441, which, by the way, is where Walmart is currently located on one corner, CVS drugstore on the other corner, a Wells Fargo on the third corner, and a Shell gas station, I believe, on the fourth corner. Target is also part of those groves that Dr. Tyre owned. Needless to say, he was probably short-sighted, but anyway, he lost. He lost that argument, and the citizens and the city council and the people of the Department of Transportation finally decided that they would locate 441 around Mount Dora as opposed to running it through the middle of Mount Dora, which, in my opinion, turned out to be a very, very wise decision. Sub-issue or sub-comment there was in trying to locate 441 around Mount Dora, there was also a proposal at one time to route it across Lake Gertrude, through Pinecrest subdivision, through Sylvan Shores, right across Lake Gertrude. That proposal also went by the wayside, and new 441 was then constructed, 4-lane highway, in its current location. We lived in Sylvan Shores. We would walk up there. We saw the construction. I watched the highway being built, and I distinctly remember as a teenager, young teenager, 12, 13, 14 years old, in the 1960s, you could go out there and you could actually lay down on 441, and you could lay there for 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes, and not a car would come by. And that's how well traveled that, or how poorly traveled that road was in the late 1960s. There was early 60s. There was also, when traffic did start to use 441, this was a game that we loved to play. We would go, a hibiscus limb was the best, but we would find a branch, again, hibiscus limb was the best, and we would cut a branch about 3 feet long, sharpen the end of it. The hibiscus branch was the best because it was very limber. We would then take an orange, because again, there were citrus groves on both sides of the new highway. There was no commercial development out there at all. And we would affix a orange to the end of this hibiscus limb, and I don't know if you've ever done this or not, but utilizing that sort of like a catapult, you could throw an orange probably 100 yards. And one of our pastimes when we were children, older children, old enough to know better, it was great fun to sit there in the orange groves, and when a semi came by on 441, see if we could not heave an orange from 100 yards away and hit the side of a semi running down the highway. That was a pastime that we did a lot of. Another pastime, again citrus related, was to, and we would do this everywhere, see if we couldn't roll oranges across a road, roll them across the road, and see if we couldn't get the cars to run over them with their tires. That was always a game of chance or challenge. It was fun to do.
Local politics in Mount Dora, I have heard through the grapevine, have always had an edge to them. They've always been, my dad used to say Wayne Moon almost lost his business when he was mayor of Mount Dora. That they've always had a little nasty edge to them. Do you remember?
Yeah, I do. Again, I was young. I'm born in 47, so, and I graduated from high school in 65, so I was a child through most of this period of time, and as a child, of course, you're not very aware of the politics as such, but there was always a yin and a yang, as I recall, and I do know one story that I can share with you. A yin and a yang between the blue-collar component of the city of Mount Dora and for lack of a better word, the white-collar component of the city of Mount Dora. And perhaps the best example of that is, I hate to come back to the dental business, but my father was an advocate of fluoridating the water. And there was entranced on the city council a much more conservative element, one which was adamantly opposed to putting anything at all, any chemical at all, in the drinking water, the potable water that we, the citizens of Mount Dora, drink. And you could certainly understand in the 1940s and 1950s why we had that, why those people were so adamantly opposed. And if you think about it today, and of all the environmental concerns that we all have today, the thought about adding chemicals to anything, our food, is not very popular today. I don't think it was very popular back in the 1960s. My father, as a dentist, felt that it was in the very best interest that the water in the city of Mount Dora be fluoridated, because he was a dentist and he could see all the kids coming in there with all the cavities. So he decided to run for city council, and in fact was elected to city council. And of course, one of his programs that he advocated was to fluoridate the water in the city of Mount Dora. I don't remember if the city council then consisted of 5 members, 6 members, or 7 members, but I'm sure that the proposal was voted down 5-1, 6-1, or 7-1, whatever it was, every time he brought it up. So, not one to give up, my father convinced some friends of his to also run for city council. He talked the local physician, Bob Montgomery, Robert H. Montgomery, to running for city council, and I believe he talked Ken Jorgensen, who was the owner of Zelwyn Farms, who also to run for city council, and he got them elected, or they got elected, and that is how the water in the city of Mount Dora got fluoridated in the early 60s, and it's still fluoridated today, as far as I know. Started kindergarten here in Mount Dora. Tom Hurlbert tells me that kindergarten was not mandatory back then, but it didn't matter. I went to kindergarten upstairs in the annex at the Methodist Church right across the street here.
Who taught you kindergarten? Do you remember?
I do not remember who taught me kindergarten. I remember all of my teachers, but I do not remember who handled the kindergarten class. And I will tell you this about, somewhat interesting about that kindergarten class. There were, and I do remember, I can tell you that, I could probably tell you 10 kids, the names of 10 people that were in that kindergarten class. But 2 of them were Michael Croak, a fellow by the name of Michael Croak, and another fellow by the name of Del Potter, and a third young boy by the name of Bernard McCabe. Bernard McCabe, Michael Croak, Del Potter, and I all started kindergarten together. That would have been 1954. No, 1953. All four of us graduated from high school together at Mount Dora High School. Del Potter, Michael Croak, and I all finished undergraduate school together at Florida State University. And we graduated from high school together, we graduated from undergraduate school together, we graduated from law school together. Del Potter, Michael Croak, and I. Bernard McCabe graduated from high school. He went to Stetson. He became an attorney also, and he became the state attorney in Pinellas County from 1990 until I think he died. Bernard just passed away recently in like January of this year, but all four of us started kindergarten together at the Methodist Church. Back then, the elementary school, there was no middle school. I don't even think there was a junior high school. There was a school, and the school was there at Roseboro, and everybody from the first grade through your senior in high school was right there at that campus, which is pretty much filled up the block between Clayton Street on the west, Fifth Avenue on the south, Highland Street on the east, and 6th, or maybe we'll call it 7th Avenue on the north. But we were all there in that one campus, and as I recall, up through the 8th grade, which in the 8th grade you're 13 years old, so that would have been 1960. And I believe it was in about 1960 that the new high school was built, which is not there anymore, but it was there until probably 10 years ago. And the new high school was built up there on Highland between, say, 6th Avenue or the extension of 6th Avenue and 7th. But through at least the 7th or 8th grade, everybody was there at what was Roseboro Elementary. I have no idea where Roseboro Elementary is today.
I think it's Montessori now. I think that school is Montessori.
Yeah, well,
whatever it is now.
That building certainly was not there.
Yeah, no.
But
the gym has been put on the National Register, I think.
I remember many a basketball game, going to many a basketball. I played polywog basketball game. I played polywog, that's what we called it, basketball.
What is that?
That was what we would now call junior high, probably, except it was 7th, 8th grade, maybe before junior high, at 9th and 10th. Junior varsity, it was before junior varsity. George Clement was our basketball coach, and today on my stocking feet, I probably am 5 feet 6 inches tall, but back then I apparently had hormone growth ahead of my classmates, and so I had a little bit of height when I was 12 or 13 or 14 years old compared to all my classmates and peers. So we did play polywog basketball in that gymnasium. I learned to swim in East Crooked Lake. There were no swimming pools in the early 1950s. There were no swimming pools at all. Everybody swam in the lake. The public swimming pool, the public swimming place, the place to go swimming for the public, was in Lake Ola. And when you came out 441, the Orange Blossom Trail, 2-lane, as you approached Tangerine on the right-hand side, there was an old motel, which I think the motel building itself is still standing right outside of town. But before you get right past Tangerine on the right-hand side. The highway, 441, comes up very close to the shores of the east side of Lake Ola. And that was a public swimming beach right before you got to that motel. And on a Saturday or a Sunday, I remember cars parked up and down that highway, and that swimming pool, that swimming place right there at Lake Ola was absolutely full of children and parents and people sunning on the beach. That was before there were any public pools at all. I'm going to guess that it was probably about 1955 or 1956 that the first public swimming pool was built up there at the Mount Dora High School campus. Probably on the on the south side of...
southeast corner there by the hurricane.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it was built there. But it was also at about that time that the owner of the property on Lake Ola fenced it off and prohibited the public from swimming there anymore. As I grew older, I always thought, well, that must have been a liability issue. The owner was worried about some child drowning there and having some potential liability. But in speaking with a fellow by the name of Charlie Lyles recently, who ran a cab here in Mount Dora, Charlie's comment to me recently was he thought that swimming place was closed as a result of integration, and that whoever the owner was, did not want that property being used by any of the black folks at that time, and so that he just happened to close it off. I know this through my entire secondary school years, from kindergarten through high school, I never went to school with a African American. I never went to school with a black person. When I went to undergraduate school at Florida State University in 1965, I do not know the actual number of black students that were on campus, but if I had to describe the number, I would say it was a handful. And even by the time I got to law school in 1968 or 1969, out of a class of 150, I suspect that there were probably not more than 10 black law students who graduated in 1972 from law school. Want to talk about East?
Yeah.
In addition to not having gone to secondary school with any African Americans or any black students, in the I had mentioned earlier our summer jobs in the citrus industry. Those were simply summer jobs. The permanent citrus workers were male, and they were all black. And the usual practice for these citrus growers, if they needed laborers in the grove, would be to go through a section of Mount Dora, which we now refer to it's now referred to as Northeast Mount Dora, but back then it was simply referred to as East Town. And that was simply a term that the population referred to that section of town. Just like in Tallahassee, they refer to that section where the blacks live as the quarters. We didn't have the quarters. We had East Town, but there was a stand on Grandview Street in East Town that was somewhat built like a pyramid. I don't even know how to describe this, except that it was pyramid shaped and it had steps that came up. It was about 10 or 12 feet long. It had a wooden cover over it. It was all enclosed. And anybody who lived in East Town who was looking for work would be on that stand at 7 o'clock in the morning, and if you needed a yard man or you needed some help, you could go there and there you would find somebody who was willing to work. East Town, as I remember it, did not have very many paved streets. I believe that Grandview was the only paved street that I remember. Lincoln may have been paved, But you have to remember that New 441 was not in existence. So if Lincoln was paved, it went nowhere because there was no highway out there. And likewise with Limit Street. I don't remember Limit Street being paved because it likewise went nowhere except possibly it connected to Wolf Branch Road. I do remember Wolf Branch Road was a clay road. And I remember Wolf Branch Road washing out one time where Wolf Branch Creek runs runs underneath Wolf Branch Road. But anyway, going back to Easttown, there were very few paved streets in Easttown. Most of the residents in Easttown, most of the women were domestic workers, maids in private residences or maids at one or two or three of the hotels in town. Our family had a maid. The first maid that I remember was Elizabeth Ash. I remember going to her wedding as a child. She got married in the front yard of her home in Easttown. Almost all of the homes that I recall, there were no concrete block homes that I remember. Almost all of the homes were wood siding, dilapidated in poor condition, screen porches, no grass in the yards. It was a common practice to have dirt yards in Easttown. This is what I remember, in which the owners would sweep with a broom or broom straw or sage broom. They would sweep the dirt, and that's how they kept their yards. Anyway, I remember going to Elizabeth Ash's wedding. I remember she had a pink or red hibiscus flower in her hair. Elizabeth was the first maid that we had, and then we had the second maid that I remember was Susanna, again a black woman. The third maid that we had was Thelma, and that either the people in Easttown either worked in the citrus industry or they were domestic help in private homes, or if the males did not work in the citrus industry, they were yard men. And I remember two yard men in particular. One whose name was LV, and LV was the yard man for the Whites, George White and Buddy White, and those are all principals of the First National Bank of Mount Dora. And then another yard man was Gus Moss, M-O-S-S, and he was our yard man. And I have no idea what those people were paid. I forgot another maid, Sally Moss, who was related to Gus Moss in one way or another. Sally is still alive. Sally was my father's maid after he got divorced in the early 60s. Sally's still alive. Sally lives out in Tangerine, and I need to go see her. Sally would make a wonderful butterscotch pie, a butterscotch praline pie with a flaky flour crust, kind of a pecan caramel praline bottom, and then a butterscotch filling on the top. It was absolutely delicious. But Sally was a good cook. All of those ladies were good cooks. And somewhere I have a photograph of, I don't know why my mother took it, but she came home one day and we had a chest freezer. I was probably 2 or 3 years old. We had a chest freezer, and my father used to buy ice cream in 2-gallon tubs or whatever from J.W. Shaw at the Rexall Pharmacy in downtown Mount Dora. And these tubs were in this chest freezer, I guess. And my mother came home one day, and I have a photo if I can find it, with Elizabeth standing there next to me. She's got me sitting up on the edge of the chest freezer with my legs inside the freezer, and the lid is open, and Elizabeth's standing there, and Elizabeth is feeding me ice cream out of one of these 2 or 3 gallon tubs. And I've always had an affinity for ice cream. I still love ice cream, but
That's funny, this son of a dentist.
yes. I do think that Mount Dora, there is a couple other little things I would like to share, but while we're on this topic, I do think that Mount Dora was culturally different than Eustis or Tiberias. You know, they referred to, somebody came up with that moniker, the Golden Triangle, well, meaning Mount Dora, Eustis, and Tiberias, which geographically formed a triangle, but I do think that Eustis was always known as a blue-collar working town. I think that Tiberias was always known as the seat of government, although they did have some citrus over, Lake Region packing was over there. But I rightfully, wrongfully, I do think that Mount Dora either definitely had a more sophisticated culture than either Eustis or Tiberias, or at least thought they had a more sophisticated culture than Eustis or Tiberias. And the examples that I can think of right away are the Ice House Players, which I believe is, it's
community
think of the word, but it's the community playhouse. I believe that Mount Dora had that long before either Eustis or Tiberias, or even Leesburg for that matter. And the symphony orchestra. Mount Dora had the community building. They would bring the symphony orchestra in here from Orlando, and we would have the mothers were trying to expose these poor children's, and the whole school would go to matinees or whatever, and we would be exposed to symphony orchestra music in the community building. So those are the 2 examples that I can think of that may have made Mount Dora seem that it was a more culturally in tune community than Eustis or Tiberias. That touch of New England, I think, I don't know who came up with that, but we had a lot of winter visitors from New England, Connecticut, Massachusetts, the Edgertons, who owned the Lakeside Inn. I don't know who came up with that saying. But I do think that there was definitely a difference, and I think we felt that growing up. We were big, these 3 communities were big rivalries in sports, big rivalries in sports. But assuming we're winding down here, I want to talk about 2 of the major events that occurred in my lifetime growing up here in Mount Dora.
Tell me about it.
One was the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which I believe took place in November of 1963. I was in Bertha Spears' Algebra 2 class when the principal came over the intercom and announced that John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. And that was such a strange event, and nobody knew what to do. We did not know where. I think it was a Friday afternoon, maybe it was a Thursday afternoon. But we were playing football. We had a football game scheduled for Friday night. Were we going to play football? We had no idea how to react. But it seems to me, in looking back, that was the first incident that led to a long line of horrible murders and assassinations and bad things that happened in America since the assassination of John F. Kennedy, including Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy. Right shortly after that, the murder of the 8 nurses in Chicago, and then the story just goes on and on and on and on to where we are today. But I don't know why that is, but that would certainly, it seemed to me that certainly marked a turning point in the society in which we live. The other event that I'm sure that you have some information about was the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, I believe that was. And I know that you have some information on this, but I'm going to tell you what my perspective was. When the Cuban Missile Crisis arose, and it struck a great deal of fear in all of the residents of Mount Dora. And I'm sure that anybody who's studied any history of the city of Mount Dora has heard this term, the catacombs, which I will tell you what I know about the catacombs, because I live right next door to where the catacombs were built, and I watched it being built. Well, the catacombs came about as a result of 20 or so families here in Mount Dora that were worried about the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis and whether or not we were going to engage in an atomic war. And so they pooled their money, and they built this bomb shelter that was constructed by J.G. Ray. I remember them because I live right next door. I watched them excavate the site. I saw them lay all the blocks. I saw them lay out the rooms. I played in there. There was a fellow by the name of T.H. Mittendorf, I believe, who lived out on Fairview Point, was one of the promoters of that bomb shelter. But Dr. Montgomery was in there, Ken Jorgensen was in there, Basil Hall was in there. Basil Hall was the Lake County Health Director. The McCabe's, Bernard McCabe was the senior, was the superintendent of public schools. My family was in there. I'm thinking there were at least 15. Bakers were in there, maybe 15 or 20 families that had all contributed. And it was designed to be self-contained for an extended period of time. Had a big steel door that was designed to prevent anybody who didn't belong there from getting in there. I believe they stored canned rations. It had a heating and ventilation system. They had weapons there. It was full bore loaded to protect those families to the exclusion of everyone else in the event of an atomic apocalypse. And of course, as the Cold War faded, interest in that bomb shelter eventually faded. To my knowledge, the bomb shelter is still there. Somebody did a news story on that bomb shelter, not, by now it could be 20 years old, that story could be 20 years old, but as far as I know, the bomb shelter is still there.
I want to thank you. This has been, during this conversation, it's like there's been 4 or 5 times when I've been like, oh, that's definitely making the movie. That's definitely making these. You've been very, very, you've told us stuff nobody else has told us.
Well,
and that's,